Good evening, wanderer of the weary mind, and welcome back to Sleepy Historian, the only place where history is delivered so gently you may not remember any of it by morning. Tonight, as the wind softly taps against your window and the creaks of the modern world settle into silence, we'll take a step, or rather, a slow, trudging shuffle, into the peculiar employment landscape of medieval Europe, a world where jobs weren't chosen so much as inherited, assigned, or simply endured. Yes, while some of us today complain about emails or awkward team meetings, in the 14th century, your career path might involve being lowered into a pit of waste, screaming convincingly at a funeral, or taste-testing soup for poison, on purpose. This episode is dedicated to the unsung labourers of the past who did what had to be done, often while holding their noses, covering their eyes, or wondering when exactly the job description changed to include screaming geese and haunted privies. So go ahead, fluff your pillow like a peasant's sagging mattress stuffed with last year's oat husks, dim your lantern, or perhaps your phone screen, and let your breath slow to the rhythm of a wooden bucket dipping into a muddy moat, as we drift gently through these forgotten professions, some messy, some morbid, some morally questionable. You may feel your own career choices suddenly improve by comparison. That, dear listener, is the magic of medieval employment. If you find yourself dozing off somewhere between the sin eater and the ale conner, do consider subscribing. Tap that like button as softly as a monk extinguishing a candle at midnight, and leave us a comment, preferably including your time and location, so we can see how far our sleepy army of history lovers reaches. Now then, eyes closed, or nearly there, let us descend gently into the odd, unwanted, and utterly unavoidable jobs of the Middle Ages. No resumes required, just a willingness to be uncomfortable, underpaid, and vaguely damp. We begin naturally with the man whose career was quite literally in the pits. If you've ever had a bad day at work, spilled coffee, grumpy co-workers, that one spreadsheet that simply refuses to align, spare a moment of compassion for the gong farmer. In medieval England, where sanitation was more suggestion than science, someone had to deal with what happened when nature called and architecture answered with a deep, dark hole in the ground. That someone was the gong farmer. The name itself is poetic in a way. Gong is derived from the Old English gang, meaning to go. And go they did, all day, into places most people avoided on instinct. The gong farmer's task, simple in theory: empty the cesspits of homes, castles, and public latrines, preferably under cover of darkness when the smell was slightly less sentient. Equipped with nothing more than a shovel, a bucket, and a level of stoicism rivaling Greek philosophers, they would climb down into the putrid abyss and begin scooping, hauling, and, one imagines, silently questioning every life decision that led them there. Their work usually began at dusk and continued into the starlit hours, when most people were mercifully asleep and therefore unable to faint from the odour. The collected waste, known euphemistically as night soil, was often transported beyond the town walls in carts covered with straw, cloth, or shame. There it might be buried, dumped in a river, or sold to farmers who, rather tragically, needed fertiliser. Surprisingly, gong farmers were paid relatively well, not lavishly, but enough to be considered skilled workers. It was compensation for the danger, discomfort, and the fact that people generally avoided them in public. Their clothes reeked, their boots squelched, and their social calendars remained mercifully empty. Yet in the quiet stillness of the pre-dawn hours, perhaps as the moonlight glinted off the contents of a half-filled pail, one might imagine the gong farmer pausing, elbow-deep in society's secrets, and contemplating the fragile dignity of labour. Or perhaps he simply counted the coins he'd earn at sunrise and imagined breakfast. And when their work was done, the gong farmer would emerge, tired but proud, perhaps with a sigh, and the slow satisfaction of a job few could tolerate, and fewer still appreciated. Of course, not every unpleasant job involved human waste. Some required an entirely different kind of constitution, one better suited to ale, civic pride, and the ever-important art of taste-testing questionable beverages. Ale conner, The booze inspector. Nobody cheered. For after the cesspits and shadows of the gong farmer, we arrive in a more fragrant, though still unpredictable chapter of medieval labour, the life of the ale conner. The title suggests festivity. One imagines a burly fellow in fine robes, hoisting tankards, patrolling taverns with a noble sense of duty and a mildly tipsy smirk. And while, yes, ale was involved, and yes, some drinking occurred, this wasn't a paid pub crawl. This was regulation, medieval style. The ale conner's job was to ensure that the ale sold in local taverns and alehouses met the kingdom's precise expectations, meaning it wasn't too weak, wasn't too strong, and most importantly, wasn't being sold at a price that would outrage either the peasantry or the monarch. Because in a world before commercial bottling, barcodes, or quality control stickers, someone had to be the mouth on the front lines. This noble taster of beer didn't simply stroll into a tavern and sip elegantly from polished goblets. Oh no, testing ale in the 14th century was far more involved. You see, one of the most peculiar testing methods wasn't about taste at all, it was about stickiness. Here's how it worked. A small wooden bench would be drizzled with ale, and the ale conner would sit in it, literally. Then they'd stand up. If their leather breeches stuck too much, it was a sign of excessive sugar or adulteration. If they rose cleanly, the ale was probably fine. That's right, quality control was assessed not by the tongue or the nose, but by one's ability to separate cheeks from furniture. It was perhaps the first known instance of regulatory butt-based science. Aside from bench-sitting, ale conners were expected to taste several brews per day. While this sounds delightful in theory, consider the circumstances. Hygiene was, at best, theoretical. Batches were inconsistent. Grains were often mixed with random herbs, chalk, or even tree bark to stretch the supply. One tankard might be watery and sad, the next dangerously alcoholic and slightly green. This constant sipping also came with pressure. If the ale was too strong, people got unruly. If it was too weak, people got angry. If it was overpriced, riots could spark over something as trivial as a sour brew. The ale conner wasn't just an inspector. They were a public safety buffer wrapped in hops and responsibility. Despite all this, the job was considered respectable. Ale was a daily necessity. It was often safer to drink than water, and the community relied on it. So while the ale conner's work was tedious and oddly sticky, it was essential. They were the quiet guardians of the medieval pint. At the end of the day, after walking from tavern to tavern, enduring grumbled complaints, suspicious glares from innkeepers, and the occasional overly fizzy explosion, the ale conner likely went home with a full belly, a heavy bladder, and the faint knowledge that civilization had not collapsed yet. But ale wasn't the only thing in need of regulation. Somewhere nearby, another unsung profession loomed in the shadows, not checking tankards, but timing executions, not sipping ales, but scheduling hangings. It's time to meet the next figure in our gallery of jobs that never made it onto motivational posters. The knocker-up, the medieval alarm clock who never quite got to sleep in. In a world before digital alarms, vibrating phones, or the cruel shriek of a bedside clock, someone had to be the human rooster. Enter the knocker-up, a profession that sounds like a euphemism, but was very real, very serious, and very underpaid. The knocker-up's job was simple: wake people up, specifically wake up those who couldn't afford to oversleep. Factory workers, bakers, chimney sweeps, and anyone whose wages depended on being up before the sunrise. But this wasn't done with gentle phone vibrations or snooze buttons. No, this was done with long sticks, pea shooters, and on occasion, a persistent sense of dread. The knocker-up would roam the streets before dawn, armed with a pole or cane which they'd use to rap against windows, often second or third story ones. The tapping wasn't violent, just repetitive, annoying, designed to break through the deepest dreams like a polite woodpecker with a moral obligation. Some used pea shooters to launch dried peas at window panes, a method both startling and oddly sustainable. A well-aimed shot could wake a sleeping baker without ever disturbing the light-sleeping landlord one floor below. Some knockers-up had dozens of clients per morning. mapped out like a grim and sleepy postman route. Now, you might wonder, who woke the knocker up? And the answer is typically no one. They didn't sleep much to begin with. Some were retirees, others insomniacs, and some were just born with an unhealthy amount of guilt about people missing their shifts. It was a job of low pay and low praise. But the knocker-up was trusted. In working-class neighbourhoods of England and parts of Ireland, especially during the Industrial Revolution, they were the difference between keeping a job and getting sacked. Oversleeping wasn't just lazy, it was dangerous. One missed day could lead to eviction, starvation, or worse, a mandatory return to agricultural labour. And while most knockers-up had a regular list of clients, some offered extra services. If you paid a little more, they'd wait outside to ensure you didn't crawl back into bed. Some even learned to read body language, watching for the light flick of curtains, the sound of a reluctant groan, or the slow creak of someone sitting up. Human lie detectors, but with canes and cold fingers. Eventually, alarm clocks caught on. Factories provided bells, bosses installed punch cards, and the knocker-up became obsolete. But for a surprisingly long stretch of history, they were part of the rhythm of waking life, unsung gatekeepers between sleep and sweat. And yet, compared to our next profession, waking up strangers with peas and pokes feels almost luxurious. Because now, we descend into the world of one of the least appreciated, most unfortunate medieval titles, the leech collector, a job that combines biology, bravery, and truly upsetting footwear. Before the modern era of clean white clinics and neatly labelled blood vials, medicine had leeches. Lots of them. They were the unsung heroes of 18th and 19th century medical theory, slurping their way across human skin in the noble pursuit of rebalancing the body's mysterious humours. But someone had to gather them. Someone had to venture, calf-deep and increasingly resentful, into murky ponds, shaded bogs and soggy pastures to pluck these squirming, bloodthirsty companions by hand. Enter the leech collector, a job for those with a strong constitution and a remarkably poor selection of career alternatives. The job description was simple. Wade into leech-infested waters and let nature take its course. No fishing rods, no nets, just your bare legs, possibly a pair of ragged trousers, and a quiet hope that you'd finish with more blood in your body than when you began. Collectors, often women, children, or elderly labourers desperate for coin, would stand still in the shallows for hours. Leeches, sensing the promise of a warm meal, would latch on eagerly, and once enough of them had attached, the collector would gently peel them off, plop them into a jar or bucket, and prepare for the next round of aquatic betrayal. This wasn't an occasional task. A good leech collector might need to gather hundreds of leeches per day. Demand was enormous. Apothecaries, surgeons, and ambitious barbers used them liberally, applying them to everything from fevers to headaches to bad moods. If your toe tingled weirdly, you might be prescribed a few ounces of leech time. There was also no such thing as leech safety. Some collectors developed anemia, others infections. Still others simply fainted from blood loss, earning a temporary break before being sent back into the bog. Protective gear? Not quite. Maybe a shawl, maybe a hat with a hole in it. To make matters more interesting, not all leeches were equal. The prized ones were Hirudo medicinalis, sleek, dark, and efficient. But these weren't always easy to distinguish from your run-of-the-mill swamp sucker, and the difference could affect your pay. It was the first job where being able to tell if your parasite was high quality determined your grocery budget. And of course, there was no health insurance, no union for leech collectors, no dental plan, no leech-proof boots, just the occasional silver coin if you did a particularly fine job not passing out in a marsh. Yet despite it all, the leech collector was vital. Without them, doctors would have had to resort to even worse ideas, like sticking you full of thorns or using mercury as cough syrup. And so, with each squelching step into the water, they held up the shaky scaffolding of medieval wellness. Today, the practice survives in some niche medical corners. But the profession? Long extinct. The bogs are quiet now. The jars are dry, and somewhere a ghostly collector still mutters, "Just 5 more and I can go home." And speaking of bizarre responsibilities, up next is a profession that might seem deceptively charming until you consider the actual work conditions. Let's meet the poor soul who kept castle candles burning and ceilings mostly not on fire, the taperer. Long before electricity, light was a luxury. Darkness didn't just fall, it smothered. When the sun dipped behind the hills and the fire in the hearth dwindled to red whispers, the only thing standing between your average noble and a stubbed toe was the humble candle. But someone had to manage all of that. Enter the taperer, the quiet, careful guardian of illumination. They weren't warriors, they weren't scholars. But without them, your average medieval castle would have been a shadowy death trap full of smoke, soot, and sprained ankles. Taperers were responsible for maintaining, placing, trimming, replacing, and relighting candles, or tapers, as they were commonly known. Candles back then weren't paraffin-scented indulgences. They were smoky, lumpy tubes of beeswax if you were rich, or animal fat if you weren't. The latter had a smell that could turn even the heartiest stomach. It wasn't just about lighting candles and walking away. Number A taperer needed to calculate burn times, especially during long ceremonies or banquets. Too many lit too early and you'd run out by the main course. Too few and you'd have bishops fumbling in the dark, mumbling Latin into their soup. They had to trim wicks at just the right moment. Too short and the flame sputtered. Too long and it smoked like an overworked chimney. They kept wax from dripping onto sacred books, embroidered cushions, or royal pets. Every flickering flame in the building was a potential disaster, and disaster had a habit of drawing attention to the person who lit it. Being a taperer also meant late nights and early mornings. One couldn't simply light up a banquet hall and head home. You had to lurk in the shadows, tending to the flames like a monkish firefighter. Some castles had dozens, even hundreds, of candles. Imagine making your rounds in a wool tunic, with a snuffer in one hand and a box of tapers in the other, as the cold stones amplified every echo of your footsteps. If you were in a church or cathedral, the role became even more delicate. There, light had theological weight. You weren't just keeping people from tripping, you were sustaining divine presence. Candles represented purity, vigilance, and heavenly truth. If one sputtered out during a sermon, eyebrows rose. If 2 went out, someone checked to see if an omen had arrived. And let's not forget the logistics. Wax needed to be measured and rationed. Supplies had to be ordered months in advance. Taperers often worked with chandlers, the folks who actually made the candles, and the quality of their tools could make or break a season's worth of illumination. Did the wax burn evenly? Did the wick last? Did it attract moths? You'd better hope not, or the Lord's dinner would include a few unexpected protein sources. Today, taperers are gone, replaced by dimmer switches and automatic timers. But once, they were as important as any guard or scribe, essential cogs in the machinery of medieval life, ensuring that shadows stayed where they belonged and that no one accidentally set fire to a manuscript. Of course, not every medieval job required such delicacy. Some demanded a much sturdier stomach. Up next, the gong farmer, a man with a shovel, a lantern, and the worst-smelling resume in history. There were many jobs in the medieval world that invited dignity, admiration, or at the very least, dry socks. This is not one of them. Enter the gong farmer, perhaps history's most tragic blend of sanitation worker and olfactory martyr. Their job was straightforward in principle, yet harrowing in practice. They removed human waste from cesspits, privy vaults, and sewer trenches, usually under the cover of night. Gong, in this case, doesn't refer to a ceremonial bell, but instead comes from an old word meaning to go, as in to go relieve oneself, which the good people of medieval cities did with great enthusiasm and little regard for plumbing. Latrines were essentially holes over pits, convenient but temporary solutions to a very permanent biological problem. Once full, someone had to come scrape it all out. That someone was the gong farmer. They worked mostly at night because, understandably, nobody wanted to see or smell the process. The tools of the trade were simple: a long-handled shovel, a sturdy bucket, a thick cloak, and an unshakable resignation to fate. A lantern might be slung from a hook on their belt, casting wobbly shadows on stone walls as they descended into basements and alleyways of bodily consequence. The cesspits themselves were often located directly under houses or courtyards, and could go months or even years without being emptied. When the day, or rather night, came, it was a special sort of homecoming for the waste. Gong farmers would descend into the darkened vaults, knee-deep in what can only be described as the tragic sediment of human routine, and begin the laborious process of scooping, hauling, and not panicking. There was no protective equipment in the modern sense, no rubber gloves, no waterproof boots, just wool, leather, and wishful thinking. And of course, the smell. Stories say it would cling to your skin and clothes for days, and even dogs avoided you. Local taverns often banned gong farmers outright, not out of cruelty, but because patrons started to gag before ordering. But, and here's the twist, it paid remarkably well. Gong farmers were often compensated handsomely for their efforts. Some even became relatively wealthy, at least by medieval labour standards. Of course, wealth is relative when your co-workers are rats and your primary workplace hazard is drowning in excrement. The contents of these pits weren't just thrown away either. They were usually carted outside city walls and sold as fertiliser. This made the gong farmer an essential node in the agricultural cycle. They gathered what urbanites expelled and delivered it to fields that grew the food for next season's feasts and eventual redeposit. A full-circle moment, if one had the stomach to consider it. Cities passed laws to regulate their work. In some areas, they were required to announce their presence with bells or cries so that others could clear the street. In others, they were legally forbidden from working during daylight hours. The risk of accidental eye contact was simply too high. In modern times, sewage systems and sanitation departments have hidden this entire world beneath layers of tile and flushable anonymity. But back then, the gong farmer was a necessary fixture of urban survival, a pungent guardian of hygiene in a time when disease lurked in every chamber pot. So next time you flush and go about your day, spare a sleepy thought for the unsung souls who once waded into the abyss by lantern light, armed with nothing but a bucket and a lifetime of bad luck. Up next, we rise, ever so slightly, from the depths to the rafters, where medieval households placed their trust in a woman whose job was 1 part herbology, 1 part divine intervention, and 10 parts elbow grease. Stay with us as we meet the wise woman laundress, patron saint of steam, salt, and suspicious stains. Some people mined for gold, others harvested wheat, but the gong farmer? He was in the business of digging up everything society wished it could forget. Gong, in this context, had nothing to do with melodious bronze percussion and everything to do with the Old English word for going. Specifically, going, number 2. In the stratified world of medieval employment, the gong farmer was the unsung sanitation saviour. His domain, the cesspits and privy vaults of cities, castles and monasteries. His tools, a long-handled shovel, a leather bucket, and optimism. His working hours, usually between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m, because the smell wasn't welcome during daylight, and neither was he. Gong farmers were responsible for removing human waste from latrines and outhouses, usually through narrow access points at the back of buildings or via vertical shafts that opened into subterranean chambers of unspeakable content. These pits were often stone-lined and could be several feet deep. When they filled, someone had to climb down and deal with it. That someone wore knee-high boots, a face scarf soaked in vinegar, and a grim expression. The job was dangerous, not just from the smell, which could allegedly knock out a monk at 10 paces, but from the methane gases, disease, and the occasional pit collapse. There are actual recorded cases of gong farmers suffocating in the very thing they were paid to remove. Dignified, not exactly, and yet the work was essential. Without regular cleaning, cesspits overflowed, turning streets into biohazard-themed obstacle courses. Gong farmers helped prevent outbreaks of typhoid, dysentery, and other delightful ailments, though ironically, they often caught them anyway. Occupational hazard. Surprisingly, the position paid quite well, especially in larger cities like London, where demand was constant. Some gong farmers became wealthy, owning carts, hiring assistants, and cornering the market on municipal waste removal. But wealth didn't translate to respect. They were ostracized, forced to live on the outskirts of town, and occasionally fined if they dared to appear in public with any trace of their work still clinging to them. Once the night's collection was complete, the waste was carted outside the city walls to be dumped in open fields, or more efficiently, sold. Yes, sold. This semi-decomposed human refuse was known as night soil, and was often used as fertilizer by farmers who couldn't afford anything less aromatic. You might say this was the medieval circular economy in action. Food went in, fertilizer came out, and the cycle of digestion continued. And if that image isn't quite soothing enough for bedtime, imagine this. The gong farmer, lantern in hand, descending into the pit like some inverse lighthouse keeper, his boots sloshing, his bucket swinging, humming a quiet tune to distract himself from the realization that this was, indeed, his Tuesday night. But not all odd medieval jobs were so fragrant. In fact, some involved precision, delicacy, and the daily risk of public humiliation. Up next, the sin eater, the only person paid to chew bread and absorb your mistakes. If you thought dinner in the Middle Ages was awkward, imagine being paid to eat someone else's sins, literally. Enter the sin eater, a figure both feared and pitied, wandering the threshold between this world and the next, armed only with a crust of bread, a cup of ale, and an extremely niche job description. When someone died, especially someone with a guilty conscience, unpaid penance, or just a generally questionable resume, it was believed their soul might linger, burdened with sins that hadn't yet been shriven. Enter the family, desperate to clear the metaphysical books before their loved one's final audit. But instead of calling a priest, in certain rural regions, especially in parts of Wales, Scotland, and the borderlands of England, they called upon the local sin eater. The ritual was simple, somber, and deeply unsettling. A meal, usually consisting of bread, salt, and ale, was placed on or near the chest of the deceased. The sin eater would approach, recite a short incantation, if literate, or just mumbled if not, and then consume the food over the corpse. The idea was that with each bite, the sins of the departed passed from the soul into the bread, and then, finally, into the sin eater themselves. Yes, that's right. The job was essentially spiritual composting. The theological logic was questionable at best, but the emotional comfort was real. Families believed this strange meal lightened the soul of the departed, helping it ascend with less celestial baggage. The sin eater, meanwhile, was believed to become progressively more burdened with each job, like a walking landfill of spiritual misdemeanors. Needless to say, nobody liked them. They were often poor, marginalized individuals, ostracized for their work, yet tolerated for the vital service they provided. They were invited into homes only to perform the ritual, then quickly ushered out, sometimes paid with food, sometimes with a coin left on a windowsill so no one had to touch them. There are records of sin eaters performing dozens, sometimes hundreds, of these rituals over their lifetimes. And though there was no formal church recognition of the practice, in fact, it was strongly frowned upon, the tradition persisted well into the 17th and even 18th centuries in some isolated areas. Did sin eaters believe they were actually absorbing sins? Some might have. Others likely saw it as an unfortunate but reliable source of calories, less a sacred calling, more a desperate survival tactic. And while we now have more modern approaches to guilt management, such as therapy, journal writing, or furiously cleaning the kitchen at 2 a.m., there's something undeniably haunting about the idea that, once upon a time, a person could be hired to digest your misdeeds. Which brings us rather neatly to our next medieval oddity, the whipping boy. Because if there's one thing royal children weren't raised to do, it was suffer their own consequences. Stay cozy. We're just getting to the part where justice wears a velvet doublet. There's being above the law, and then there's being so above punishment that someone else has to be spanked for you. In the tender, confusing realm of royal childhoods, where little kings-to-be were cloaked in silk and excessive praise, discipline became a bit of a problem. You couldn't just go around whipping the future ruler of England, now could you? What if he caught a fever? Or worse, a grudge? Enter the whipping boy, a solution so deeply medieval it almost loops back around to genius. The role was as straightforward as it was tragic. The whipping boy was a carefully selected child, often of noble but not royal birth, raised alongside a young prince. He played with him, studied with him, and became his closest companion. But his real job, to be punished on behalf of the royal when said royal inevitably misbehaved. If the future monarch refused his Latin homework, broke a window with a well-aimed goblet, or simply grew bored and declared a day off from etiquette training, it was the whipping boy who got the rod, literally, in front of everyone. Why would this ever work, you ask? Well, the entire concept rested on one extremely hopeful assumption, that the prince would be emotionally attached enough to his companion that seeing him punished would make the royal feel guilt, thus discouraging further mischief. In some cases, this strategy genuinely had emotional weight. There are accounts of princes begging their tutors to stop, apologising profusely on their friend's behalf, and even sneaking him treats afterward in apology. But then again, not all future kings were known for their empathy, and one can imagine certain young nobles viewing the whipping boy less as a moral deterrent and more as a consequent sponge with good handwriting. It wasn't an entirely miserable existence. Whipping boys often received excellent educations, access to court, and the kind of networking only available to those routinely beaten in front of dukes. A lucky few even rose to positions of power in adulthood, bolstered by their early connection to the crown. Still, one has to wonder what dinner conversations were like. Good day at court? Not really. He spilled wine on the bishop's shoes again, so I got caned and missed pudding. Of course, this role faded out as monarchies gradually came to terms with the idea that perhaps princes should be held accountable for their own temper tantrums. Novel concept. But while we're on the subject of strange medieval arrangements involving guilt, pain, and questionable logic, our next role might take the biscuit, especially if that biscuit has been sitting inside a plague doctor's beak mask. Yes, it's time to put on your bird nose and delve into the world of plague physicians, whose bedside manner involved long sticks, powerful scents, and enough herbs to stock an apothecary. Tuck yourself in. Things are about to get medically speculative. If the Black Death was the Middle Ages' worst houseguest, then the plague doctor was the unfortunate host with a clipboard, trying to make polite conversation while everything caught fire. Let's set the scene. It's the 14th century, and the air smells like fear, and maybe rotting onions. Across Europe, people are dying in such staggering numbers that graveyards start stacking tenants like medieval apartment buildings. The cause, unknown. The cure, heavily debated. The solution, send in a man wearing a leather beak full of herbs and hope for the best. The plague doctor wasn't always a trained physician. In fact, many weren't. Cities, desperate to look like they were doing something productive, often hired anyone who could hold a walking stick and stomach the smell of the recently expired. The iconic outfit, long waxed coat, gloves, wide-brimmed hat, and of course the beaked mask. was less about scientific protection and more about olfactory survival. People believed disease travelled through miasma or bad air, so stuffing a hollow beak with lavender, cloves and mint seemed like a perfectly reasonable defence. And then there was the plague stick, a long wooden rod used to examine patients from a socially distanced metre away. Think of it as the world's first contactless thermometer, minus any ability to actually measure temperature. If a patient didn't flinch when poked, things weren't looking good. Plague doctors also acted as record keepers, noting down symptoms, deaths, and last words, though most entries probably read like came in sneezing, left horizontal. They were often tasked with performing basic surgeries, bloodletting, and sometimes administering horrifying treatments such as boil lancing or onion poultices. An unlucky few were even asked to conduct post-mortem dissections, although that often led to the doctor himself becoming the next dissection subject. Despite all of this, the plague doctor was oddly respected. They embodied a paradox, both a source of hope and a walking omen. If you saw one on your street, it meant someone nearby was very sick. If he knocked on your door, it probably meant you were. Compensation varied wildly. In some towns, plague doctors were offered large salaries and promised pensions, mostly because no one else wanted the job. In others, they were paid with food, housing, or vague gestures of eternal gratitude. Some were even locked inside quarantine zones with their patients, presumably under the logic that if they survived, they'd be stronger for it. Yet for all their theatrics and herbal air fresheners, the plague doctors were doing their best, however misinformed. They believed in balance, humours, and trying not to breathe too deeply. And while they couldn't stop the spread of disease, they at least provided the comforting illusion that someone was in charge. Eventually, as our understanding of germs improved and hygiene became a thing, the beaked suit was retired, though it's had a surprising second life in Halloween costumes and overly dramatic history documentaries. And with that, we leave the reeking alleyways of plague-ridden Europe and shuffle toward a far more glamorous, if equally dangerous, career. The gong farmer, the man who knew everyone's business, especially after they flushed it. Light your lantern, friend. Things are about to get earthy. While the castle steward managed the wine cellar and the knight managed the battlefield, someone brave, underpaid and underwashed had to manage the latrines. And that someone was the gong farmer. Yes, in the great tapestry of medieval society, the gong farmer was the bottom stitch. His job, quite literally to dig through human waste, a role so unpleasant, so gloriously grim, that even bards wouldn't write songs about it. To understand the gong farmer's world, we need to journey downward, into the cesspits, privy vaults, and night-soil trenches that sat beneath towns and castles. In the absence of plumbing, most waste simply sat there, collecting, stewing, occasionally bubbling in ways that suggested an alchemist's experiment gone wrong. Enter the gong farmer, whose work took place mostly at night, partly for discretion, mostly to avoid the worst of the smell in the midday heat. Armed with long-handled scoops, wooden buckets, and a constitution forged in desperation, he would descend into the pits and begin the long, slow process of removing what history delicately referred to as night soil. It was back-breaking, nose-burning, shoe-ruining labour. The word gong itself is believed to have come from gang, meaning to go. So a gong farmer was, in the most literal sense, a goer of going, a night shift alchemist turning human waste into compost, or at least into something that could be carted far away. The job was so offensive to the senses that gong farmers were required by law to live outside city walls. They weren't allowed to work during daylight hours and were sometimes even banned from entering churches or public gatherings. One might say they were socially flushed. Despite their isolation, their role was essential. Without them, medieval cities would have become unbearable, overflowing not just with metaphorical corruption, but with very real effluence. Gong farmers helped prevent disease, kept latrines functional, and turned waste into a rudimentary form of fertilizer. In a strange way, they were early environmentalists, very smelly environmentalists. Payment varied wildly. In larger cities like London, they were sometimes paid quite well for their efforts, though it's safe to say no one took the job for the glory. Others were forced into it as a punishment, often for crimes like theft or vagrancy, because nothing says learn your lesson like being handed a shovel and pointed toward a sewer. There were even recorded guilds and laws regulating the profession. In some towns, gong farmers had to be licensed. In others, they had designated dumping zones, far enough from water sources and market stalls to avoid contaminating daily life or dinner. Protective clothing, if it could be called that, consisted of leather aprons, high boots, and often a headscarf soaked in vinegar to mask the stench. Some accounts mention entire outfits coated in wax or pitch to keep the mess off. But let's be honest, nothing really kept the mess off. Yet, for all its indignity, the gong farmer's role was as crucial as it was unsung. Medieval society could not function without them. Knights could joust, monks could pray, kings could tax, but if the privies weren't emptied, the entire city would notice. Quickly. And so, we raise a metaphorical clothespin to the men who toiled in the dark, who knew every noble's digestive schedule better than their own families, and who walked the fine line between necessity and nausea. But we must press on, even if the path is now mercifully cleaner. Our next subject had less to do with muck and more to do with movement, the sin-eater, a figure who performed spiritual sanitation for the medieval conscience. So tuck yourself in, breathe deeply through your nose, now that you safely can, and prepare to meet the man who made absolution a side hustle. In the delicate business of dying well, something medieval people took very seriously, there was a problem. Sometimes one died before a priest could arrive. Sometimes one died with sin still clinging to the soul like a particularly persistent tax collector. And in such times, a strange figure emerged from the shadows of folklore and desperation. The sin-eater. He wasn't a clergyman. He wasn't officially sanctioned by the church. In fact, the church rather frowned upon his existence. But for those living in remote villages, where priests travelled slowly and death travelled quickly, the sin-eater was a practical solution to a spiritual panic. The process was symbolic, at best. A piece of bread and a bowl of ale were placed on the chest of the deceased. The sin-eater would sit beside the body, mutter a few incantations or words of mourning, then consume the food, thereby eating the sins of the departed. The idea was that by ingesting the physical elements representing guilt and wrongdoing, the sin-eater would carry the spiritual burden away. Or at least, out the door. Did it work? Theologically, no. Medically, absolutely not. Socially, it offered closure. The family could rest knowing the soul of their loved one had been given a second chance, even if it was served on rye bread. Sin-eaters weren't particularly loved. In fact, they were usually feared, viewed as unclean, spiritually tainted, and quite literally full of everyone else's moral failings. Children were warned not to stare at them. Some towns wouldn't allow them to live within the village itself. There are records of sin-eaters being paid in secrecy and expected to disappear before the sun rose. And yet, they were needed, desperately. For the poor especially, who couldn't afford elaborate funerals or official last rites, the sin-eater was the last act of kindness, or at least of tradition, a final visitor before burial. A man who showed up, said nothing, and left with more baggage than he arrived with. There was no formal training, no exams, no certificate. One simply became a sin-eater the way one becomes a rumour, quietly and with a lot of suspicion. Some say it was a role passed down in families. Others claim it was taken up by social outcasts, those already on the margins, for whom dignity was no longer a luxury. Either way, it was a lonely career path. One could say they were consumed by their work. Over time, the role faded. Church authorities clamped down on what they saw as pagan or heretical practices. The rise of better access to priests, hospitals, and formal rituals made the sin-eater obsolete. But in some rural corners of Britain and Wales, whispers of the practice continued well into the 19th century. And so we remember them, not with reverence perhaps, but with a strange, sleepy gratitude. They were spiritual janitors of the afterlife, scooping up guilt like crumbs from a table no one else dared to clean. Now, let's move from the solemn to the oddly specific. Our next medieval job is less about souls and more about songbirds, because in the grand economy of niche professions, someone had to collect feathers from live geese without starting a riot. Yes, really. Feathers were currency, and it was someone's job to pluck them, strategically, carefully, and hopefully without losing an eye. There are few jobs in the medieval world that combined patience, stealth, and an intimate understanding of fowl-related grudges, quite like that of the goose plucker. Before pillows were mass-produced, before quills were rolling off factory floors, and long before decorative feather hats were the indulgence of Renaissance fairs, someone had to gather the raw materials. And those raw materials were, well, still attached to geese, which were not known for their generosity. Goose plucking wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't a hobby, it was a seasonal, repetitive, and peculiarly respected occupation, because featherbeds, arrow flights, and ink-stained letters all had one thing in common. They depended on a steady supply of clean, strong feathers, especially from geese. But here's the twist. The birds weren't always dead. Live plucking was a thing, an actual, widespread practice in certain areas, performed with grim efficiency and, often, a complete lack of sentiment. The idea was that a healthy goose could be partially plucked several times a year. After all, feathers grew back, eventually. It was efficient, economical, and absolutely guaranteed to earn the plucker a few battle scars. Picture the scene. A low wooden bench, a burlap sack for discarded fluff, and a professional trying to hold down a honking, flapping, deeply offended goose with one hand, while gently yanking out its downy undercoat with the other. The air would be thick with feathers, sweat, and whispered regrets. It took skill. A bad plucker could damage the feather. A worse one could damage the bird. The best pluckers worked with speed and calm. One eye on the goose's beak, the other on their sack count. There was usually a quota. A plucker could go through dozens of geese in a single morning, each one louder and more irritable than the last. Sometimes entire villages would be summoned to help during peak plucking season. Families gathered in yards and barns, each with their assigned bird, each child trying desperately not to get pecked in the ear. Old women were considered especially good at the job. Small hands, firm grip, and decades of experience dealing with creatures that hissed when touched. The feathers were sorted carefully, down for bedding, long strong quills for writing, decorative feathers for hats or heraldry. Even broken scraps had use, as kindling, stuffing, or fishing lures. The job wasn't glamorous, it was messy. Feathers got everywhere, in hair, mouths, clothing. The scent of goose oil lingered on skin for days. Pluckers often wore simple tunics and tied rags around their noses, not for fashion, but to avoid sneezing their lungs out from airborne fluff. And of course, there were injuries. Goose bites, wing slaps, blunt trauma to the pride. It wasn't unheard of for a particularly cantankerous goose to escape mid-process and launch a barnyard coup, honking all the way into the neighbour's cabbage patch. In some regions, pluckers were paid in feathers rather than coin, which sounds romantic until you realise a feather economy is only useful if you already own a mattress shop. Others plucked for landlords or lords, their labour part of the feudal taxes owed each year, because yes, there were ledgers where people literally paid their dues in sacks of feathers. Over time, the practice waned. Animal welfare concerns and the general risk of death by poultry uprising led to less live plucking and more posthumous gathering. Still, the echoes of this work remain in every feather pillow and every quill scribbled across parchment. And so we salute the goose pluckers, not for their style, not for their scent, but for their ability to look a furious bird in the eye and say, "I need your undercoat more than you do." Now, shake off the imaginary fluff, because our next medieval occupation trades birds for bones. Quite literally, we're headed into the world of bone collectors, the careful, solemn, sometimes slightly too enthusiastic professionals who specialised in gathering, arranging, and displaying the dead. Because in the medieval era, nothing said job security like a skeleton that couldn't complain. Not all medieval jobs were performed among the living. Some involved a quieter clientele, silent, still, and typically past the point of complaint. Enter the bone collector, a role as macabre as it was surprisingly tidy. In an age where churchyards were small, plague pits were many, and population pressure wasn't just about housing, but also about where to store your dearly departed, someone had to handle the logistics. You couldn't just keep burying people indefinitely in the same square of land and hope for the best. Eventually, someone noticed that bones didn't decompose quickly, and also they took up valuable real estate. Thus, the bone collector was born. Their job was simple in description, less so in practice. Exhume, sort, clean, and store human remains. They worked in graveyards, crypts, monasteries, and the occasional cave. Their workplaces included ossuaries, those dry, quiet places where the remains of thousands were carefully, almost artistically, stacked, sorted, and sometimes arranged into unsettling decor. This wasn't grave robbing. Bone collectors weren't after treasure, only tibias. They waited patiently, sometimes years, until a body had decayed naturally. Then, with solemn efficiency, they'd return to the grave, remove what was left, and prepare the bones for long-term storage. Bones had to be cleaned, not polished to a shine, but gently scraped of soil, debris, and any lingering organic material. Water, vinegar, and wire brushes were common tools of the trade. All of this was done respectfully, or at least according to church-approved procedures that walked the delicate line between spiritual reverence and janitorial necessity. Some collectors worked under priests, others were monks themselves, part of the caretaking duties assigned to cloisters or cathedrals. A few were lay people, hired hands with steady stomachs and fewer opinions about sanitation. The bones were sorted by type, skulls in one pile, femurs in another, smaller bones in baskets or shelves. In some ossuaries, they were stacked in geometric precision, walls made of rib cages, arches from Olney, even chandeliers of finger bones. This wasn't just storage, it was architecture with a skeletal twist. famous ossuaries like Sedlec in the Czech Republic are examples of how bone collectors took their craft to its most surreal and stylized extremes. But even in more modest churches across Europe, the practice persisted. Bones weren't garbage, they were remains, and remains had to be, well, remained with. It was considered a spiritual act. Caring for the dead meant easing their transition to the afterlife, or at least keeping their earthly vessels from being dug up by pigs or accidentally disturbed by grave diggers. In some cases, families could pay for their loved ones' bones to be displayed in a particular niche, a kind of post-mortem upgrade. Bone collectors weren't necessarily morbid. In fact, many of them were described as calm, diligent, and strangely chipper. After all, their clients didn't argue, the hours were quiet, and the work offered a unique perspective on life's brevity and the importance of proper stacking. They wore aprons, they used hooks, they travelled with handcarts and sacks, and on feast days, some even carried relics, finger bones of saints, fragments of martyrs, placed in reliquaries and paraded before congregations who nodded solemnly at the shin bone of Saint Nobody in particular. Eventually, with changes in burial laws and urban development, bone collection faded as a profession, but in certain corners of Europe, in the cool stone crypts below ancient chapels, their work still lines the walls. So tonight, if your dreams wander toward candlelit chambers filled with the whispers of history, think kindly of the collector who kept things organized, one skull at a time. And now, from the quiet halls of the dead, we march into the cold fields of early mornings, where another medieval profession required more shouting, less reverence, and a good pair of boots, the village crier. Because long before smartphones or town gossip, someone had to yell the news into your window at dawn. If your medieval sleep was ever interrupted by the sound of someone shouting in the street about a new pig tax, it wasn't a dream. It was the village crier, delivering the day's finest blend of news, decrees, and miscellaneous drama directly into your ears. Before newspapers, billboards, or frustrating social media algorithms, there was a single man with a bell and a pair of sturdy lungs. His job? Make sure every soul in the village, from the miller's deaf aunt to the hungover blacksmith's apprentice, heard what the Lord, the crown, or the church needed them to know. And yes, that included you, even if you were still in your straw-stuffed mattress, trying to pretend the rooster didn't exist. The crier's morning began early, often just after sunrise. He'd don his cloak, weatherproof if he was lucky, lice-ridden if he wasn't, grab his bell or clapper, and set off through the winding streets. The announcement circuit was carefully planned, like a milkman route, but with more shouting and fewer cows. "Oyez, oyez, oyez," he would cry, which means, "Hear ye," though few villagers knew what ye meant, and fewer still cared. The words didn't matter as much as the volume. The point was to pierce the quiet, get your attention, and hold it just long enough to declare that the market would be closed for plague fumigation, or that you should stop dumping fish guts near the church. Criers announced everything: royal edicts, marriage bans, public punishments, wheat shortages, tax hikes, missing goats, and travelling musicians who may or may not be spies. If someone was going to be placed in the stocks at noon, it was the crier's job to turn it into a town event. If bread prices went up by a farthing, he was the voice of collective outrage, usually while dodging stale crusts. They were part newscaster, part town gossip, and part public speaker, though without any podium, script, or occasionally teeth. Despite the shouting, the job required diplomacy. Saying the wrong thing, or saying the right thing too loudly near the wrong noble, could result in a sudden vacancy in the shouting profession. Criers walked a line between servant and authority. They weren't quite officials, but they weren't commoners either. Their role was ceremonial, practical, and deeply annoying to those trying to sleep in. Their cries were accompanied by bells, rattles, or banging sticks, anything to slice through the morning fog. Some used rhyme to make messages more memorable, particularly during festivals or executions, because what's a public hanging without a catchy couplet? Occasionally, they had to deliver bad news, tax increases, crop levies, curfews. On those days, they wore thick boots and ran fast. There are records, honest, dusty records, of criers being chased out of town for announcing that ale prices would double by decree of His Royal Majesty. Some cried from horseback, others from atop barrels or wagons, all of them from within arm's reach of someone cranky. Being a crier meant having a voice like thunder and the skin of a turnip, thick, durable and unbothered by being thrown at. You weren't just a person, you were a walking megaphone. The position was often hereditary. A father crier might pass his bell to his son, along with a strong vocal technique and several embarrassing rhymes about pig theft. And for many, it was a badge of honour. Even if everyone pretended to hate the morning racket, they relied on the crier to keep life moving. Eventually, criers faded out as printing presses and literacy spread, but some towns still retain honorary ones, dressed in fine cloaks with golden bells, trotted out for festivals and historic reenactments. They're reminders of a time when public communication involved a man yelling, "Oi!" at your window before breakfast. So, next time your alarm clock startles you, spare a sleepy thought for the medieval villager, startled by a red-faced man shouting news about leprosy outside their door. Next, we turn our attention to something far more fragrant, because in medieval towns, where sanitation was more of a suggestion than a standard, someone had to handle the less than glorious work of gong farming. Yes, it's exactly what you think it is, and worse. As we drift even deeper into medieval occupations, we arrive at one of the most malodorous and underappreciated roles in all of history, the gong farmer. If you've never heard of this noble title, rest assured it wasn't printed on many family crests. But without gong farmers, medieval towns and cities would have collapsed under the sheer weight of their own waste, quite literally. Gong was the polite medieval term for, shall we say, human byproducts. And farming referred not to growing crops, but to the act of harvesting something far less appetizing, the contents of privies, cesspits, and latrines. The gong farmer was the one called in, often by moonlight, to empty these repositories of medieval digestion. Why at night? Because no one wanted to witness or smell the process in daylight, and because the streets were quieter, allowing the gong farmers to maneuver their carts and buckets through narrow lanes without bumping into too many respectable townsfolk or dropping an unpleasant splash on someone's cloak. The job was physically demanding. Cesspits could be several feet deep, layered with years of waste. The gong farmer would descend, often chest deep, using long-handled shovels, scoops, and buckets to remove the muck. Protective clothing was minimal, perhaps a leather apron, thick gloves, and a cloth tied over the mouth, though none of this truly kept out the odour. Their tools were simple, heavy buckets, a cart with thick wheels to handle the bumpy cobblestones, and an iron rake for scraping the stubborn bits from stone and timber walls. A lantern hung nearby, casting flickering light on a scene no one wished to see in clarity. Once filled, the buckets were carried, carefully, through the streets to the outskirts of town, where the waste was dumped in designated pits or used as fertilizer on distant fields. Occasionally, more unscrupulous farmers would tip their cargo into rivers under cover of darkness, much to the chagrin of anyone downstream. The dangers of the trade were real. The fumes from decomposing waste could be overwhelming, even deadly. There are accounts of gong farmers collapsing mid-task, either from lack of air or from slipping and drowning in the muck. Yet, despite these risks, the pay was surprisingly decent because no one else wanted the job. It was one of the rare medieval roles where demand always exceeded supply. Socially, gong farmers were tolerated but shunned. They lived on the fringes of towns or in segregated quarters, their profession marking them as necessary but unwelcome. Even tavern keepers were hesitant to serve them, though a generous bribe of ale might sometimes grant them a corner table, well away from the fireplace. And yet, without them, towns would have become unlivable. Disease spread quickly in medieval cities, and keeping the cesspits from overflowing was a crucial public health service, even if no one dared call it that. Gong farmers developed their own crude camaraderie and dark humour. There are tales of rival farmers competing over the best contracts, large manors and bustling inns producing more yield than smaller homes. Some farmers even passed their business down through generations, their sons inheriting not just the tools, but the secrets of the trade, which cesspits were deepest, which ones leaked, and which customers were most generous at Christmas. By the late medieval period, the role of the gong farmer slowly faded as better sanitation and sewer systems were introduced, though many cities would still rely on manual emptying well into the early modern era. So, as you fluff your pillow tonight and enjoy the miracle of modern plumbing, spare a sleepy moment for the men who once braved the depths of medieval sanitation, armed with a bucket and an iron constitution. Next, we move from the murky world of waste to something equally curious. The medieval job of the knocker-up, because alarm clocks weren't always mechanical, and sometimes the best way to wake up was a stick tapping on your window. Among the more eyebrow-raising medieval professions, the barber surgeon holds a special place, nestled somewhere between beauty service and battlefield triage. In an era when doctor wasn't quite a regulated career and medical schools were few and far between, people turned to the next best thing, their local barber. After all, who better to handle sharp implements near your vital organs than someone who daily wielded blades near your jugular? The barber's red and white pole, still used as a symbol for barbershops today, originated from this peculiar dual role. The red represented blood, the white, the bandages used to staunch it, a clear, if somewhat unsettling, advertisement of their services. A typical barber surgeon's day might begin with straightforward trims and shaves, their chairs filled with customers seeking fashionable haircuts or neat beards. But soon enough, the line would shift, villagers seeking boils lanced, wounds stitched, or even teeth extracted would file in, looking rather less relaxed than the earlier clientele. In many cases, barber surgeons also handled bloodletting, a popular but misguided treatment for nearly every ailment under the medieval sun. Whether you suffered from headaches, fevers, or melancholy, you'd likely be offered a well-placed incision or a leech to balance your humours. But the barber surgeon's true moment to shine came when things got serious. If a farmer broke a leg in the fields, or a soldier took a nasty cut in battle, the barber surgeon was summoned with haste. They would set bones, stitch gashes, and even attempt rudimentary amputations, armed with saws, knives, and a disturbing degree of confidence. Sterilization, of course, wasn't part of the process. Tools were wiped on whatever cloth was handy, aprons, tunics, or even the patient's own garments, and hands were rinsed in cold water, if at all. Infection was a constant risk, but without a clear understanding of germs, barber surgeons focused on speed and practicality. getting the job done before shock or blood loss could claim the patient. Despite this, many were highly skilled for their time. Years of hands-on experience made seasoned barber surgeons adept at reading wounds, calming terrified patients, and performing complex procedures with surprising success. In some towns, they were more trusted than formally trained physicians, whose academic theories often failed in practice. Of course, there were drawbacks. Imagine settling in for a quick trim, only to find yourself next in line behind a man bleeding profusely from a leg injury. The mingling of barbery and surgery made for an atmosphere that was, at best, eclectic, and at worst, deeply unsettling. But practicality won out. In smaller towns and villages, one multi-skilled tradesman was preferable to none, and so the barber-surgeon remained a fixture of medieval life, his striped poles spinning lazily in the breeze, promising both coiffed hair and emergency medical care under one rickety roof. And with that, our strange journey through forgotten professions continues. Let us now turn to a role less bloody, but no less essential: the almoner, the medieval equivalent of social services, who managed charity with a LED ledger and a keen eye for both poverty and potential fraud. Among the many ancient professions that history has, for some reason, seen fit to record, few seem quite as profoundly unrewarding as that of the brick carrier, or as they were more commonly known in dusty Mesopotamian records, the ones with sore backs. Picture the great cities of antiquity: Babylon with its ziggurats, Thebes with its temples, Rome with its seemingly endless aqueducts and forums. Each stone, each slab, each moulded, sun-baked brick required not only the master builder's plan or the mason's skillful touch, but also the sheer human endurance of someone to haul the material from pile to site, from riverbank to scaffold, from dust to sky. The job of the brick carrier began before sunrise. In the cool, pre-dawn hours, workers would shuffle to the building sites, shoulders already aching in anticipation. Their tools were simple: woven baskets, leather slings, wooden trays balanced on heads or backs. If they were fortunate, a donkey might be loaned for the heaviest hauls, though often the donkey required nearly as much feeding and watering as the worker himself, so it wasn't always seen as a benefit. Work orders were flexible. Sometimes the master builder needed thousands of uniform bricks for a temple facade. Other days, oddly shaped rubble had to be cleared from one section of wall to make room for new construction. And occasionally, entire sections of mud brick needed to be carried away after an architectural miscalculation, meaning the same worker might end the day hauling back what they'd spent the morning delivering. The hazards were many. Sharp shards of broken stone could slice through rope or basket. A poorly stacked load could tip mid-step, sending bricks tumbling and bruising shins or worse. Narrow scaffolds at increasing heights offered thrilling opportunities for accidental acrobatics, and always there was the relentless sun, beating down mercilessly by mid-morning, turning each step heavier. Food rations were uninspiring. Coarse bread, onions, perhaps dried dates if the foreman was feeling generous. Water was crucial, but too much slowed the limbs. Too little led to dizziness, or worse. Brick carriers worked alongside masons and sculptors, but with none of the prestige. They were expected to be invisible, tireless, and expendable. Records from Egypt and Mesopotamia hint at the sheer physical toll of the work. Skeletons of known labourers show compressed vertebrae, bowed legs, and shoulders worn by decades of burden. There were no long retirements, only a gradual slowing of pace, until the overseer deemed the worker unfit, and another young back took their place. At day's end, after hundreds of trips across loose earth and rickety scaffolds, the brick carrier would stagger back to shared quarters, fingers raw, feet blistered, spine humming with the dull ache of exhaustion. And what monuments rose above their toil? Glorious temples, mighty walls, rulers immortalized in stone. But nowhere were the names of the brick carriers inscribed. Their legacy was written only in the weathered bricks themselves, stacked one upon another, by hands we do not know, still feeling cozy, good, because next we'll peek into the life of ancient tanner, whose days were soaked in more than just sweat, and whose job guaranteed they'd never be welcome at dinner parties again. Now, if brick carrying was an ancient job that broke the back, tanning was the profession that broke the nose. In every early civilization that required shoes, saddles, belts, water skins, scroll covers or shields, that is to say, nearly all of them, there was an unsung class of workers toiling day after day to transform animal hides into usable leather. The process was long, odorous, and altogether unpleasant. The ancient tanner's day started not at the rising of the sun, but at the arrival of animal carcasses, a cheerful delivery from the local butcher, hunter, or slaughterhouse. The hides, fresh and full of promise, and other less desirable substances, were first scraped of flesh, fat, and hair. This was performed with curved blades on wooden beams, a task requiring strength, stamina, and a tolerance for the close company of flies. Once suitably scraped, the hides began their long bath, often in vats of water mixed with various natural substances. In early Europe and the Mediterranean, this could mean lime, wood ash, or even fermented urine. Yes, ammonia-rich urine was a prized ingredient, known for helping to soften the hide and separate the last stubborn bits of hair and tissue. Many tanners kept their own, collection pots, or relied on household contributions. The phrase, "don't waste a drop," had, in this instance, a particularly pungent meaning. With hides soaking away, the tanner's work continued. Vats had to be stirred and monitored. Hides were pulled out, checked for pliability, then scraped again. The entire process could stretch over weeks, sometimes months, depending on the type of leather desired. Goat, calf, deer, ox, each required its own careful balance of treatment and time. The smell of a tannery was legendary, situated downstream, downwind, or well outside city limits. Tanning pits were avoided by those with any sense of self-preservation. Tanners themselves became permanently perfumed with the aroma of their craft, regardless of how much they scrubbed. A tanner's spouse, if they had one, either developed an iron constitution or a separate sleeping chamber. Social invitations were rare. Still, tanning was indispensable. Soldiers needed leather straps and armor. Scribes required parchment. Merchants and peasants alike wore leather shoes and belts. Despite the odors and social stigma, the tanner held a place of grudging respect, necessary but not celebrated. Occupational hazards were plenty. Infections from cuts, respiratory issues from constant inhalation of fumes, skin conditions from contact with caustic substances, gloves, aprons. Those would be centuries away. The ancient tanner worked bare-handed, sleeves rolled, often barefoot in shallow pits of dubious liquid. At day's end, weary and redolent, the tanner might stagger home with stained clothes and aching muscles. Pay was steady, but the job was eternal. There was always another hide to prepare, another order to fill. And the smell? That lingered through the night and well into the morning. So if you ever thought your modern job was thankless, imagine rising each day to bathe in ammonia, handle half-rotted skins, and be greeted on the street with wrinkled noses and wide detours. Still relaxed, wonderful, because next we'll slide seamlessly into the gritty life of the ancient fullers, the original dry cleaners who definitely didn't work dry, and whose profession involved far more stomping than you'd expect. As the saying might have gone, had anyone cared to say it, clean clothes are a luxury, but someone must make them so, and in ancient times, that unenviable task fell to the fullers, a profession often overlooked in scrolls and rarely carved into stone. The fullers of Rome, Greece, and earlier civilizations were the masters of fabric maintenance. Before soap was common, before washing machines whirred contentedly in every home, fullers stood ankle-deep in vats of pungent liquid, stomping away at the tunics, cloaks, and linens of the well-to-do. Why stomping, you ask? Well, mechanical agitation was required to loosen dirt, oils, and stains from woven fibres. Fullers discovered that the human foot, with its excellent balance, weight distribution, and fatigue-resistant nature, made for an ideal laundry tool, and so, barefoot or in thin sandals, they would step rhythmically in vats of warm water mixed with a cleansing agent. And what was this agent? You may already sense a theme in these ancient trades. The preferred additive was fermented urine. Rich in ammonia, urine served as an effective degreaser and whitening agent. Citizens, temples, and even businesses would collect it in pots and jars for sale to local fullers. In Rome, the collection was so systematic that the Emperor Vespasian famously taxed the urine trade, a tax known even today as the vectigal uriny. Thus, a fuller's workshop, often located in dedicated streets of the city or just beyond the busiest districts, was a place of many scents and little glamour. Workers stomped garments underfoot, sang rhythmic work songs to pace themselves, and occasionally hauled dripping bundles from vat to vat for rinsing and drying. The job required endurance, for a fuller's day could stretch long into the evening. Heavy woolen cloaks soaked with water weighed far more than one might think. Each item had to be wrung, beaten against stones, or hung strategically to prevent shrinkage or damage. There was a certain science to it all. The fullers knew how to whiten wool, how to soften coarse linen, and how to preserve the vibrancy of dyed fabrics. They had to navigate the delicate balance of cleaning without destroying, no small task when the garments in question belonged to aristocrats, senators, or temple officials. A tunic too harshly treated might fade or tear. An expensive purple-dyed cloak ruined in the vat could mean a loss of reputation, or worse, a visit from a wealthy, angry patron. Yet for all their skill, fullers remained among the more humble of trades. They were rarely invited to dine with their clients, and were easy to spot in public thanks to the persistent scent of their work. Even off-duty, the fullers' hands were marked, red, roughened by alkaline liquids and long hours of labour. Their feet, too, bore the imprint of endless stomping, and so, day after day, they stepped and rinsed, wrung and hung, preserving the civility of society's appearance while bearing the brunt of its laundry. For them, there were no feast days, no lavish tributes, just the steady slap of fabric in water, and the faint hope that tomorrow's batch would be a little smaller than today's. As the sun rose over the wetlands and meandering rivers of ancient lands, a particular kind of worker prepared for a day that few would envy. While merchants unfurled their awnings and farmers readied their tools, the leech collectors, part biologists, part daredevils, stepped barefoot into the shallows. In a time when medical science was still bound by the humours, leeches were prized as agents of balance and cure. Physicians, from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe, prescribed bloodletting for all manner of ailments, fevers, headaches, swollen joints, melancholia, and more. And what better assistant for the task than a hungry, well-placed leech? Of course, before these little creatures could do their work in the clinics and baths of the city, someone had to harvest them. Enter the leech collector, clad in garments they didn't mind ruining, though for many, rags would suffice. These workers waded slowly into marshes, ponds, and streams. The goal? To present themselves as an inviting meal. That's right, human skin was the bait, standing ankle-deep, knee-deep, sometimes even waist-deep. Leech collectors waited patiently, and soon, drawn by the warmth of the body and the trace scent of blood, the leeches would emerge from the mud and silt, questing with tiny mouths for a spot to latch onto. Collectors learned to recognize the good ones, the large, fat-bellied varieties most valued by physicians. They also learned which species were best left alone, or which might leave an infection behind. As the leeches attached themselves to legs and feet, the collectors waited until the creatures were well engaged. Then, with deft fingers, they would gently peel them off and deposit them into clay pots, wooden boxes, or specially prepared leather pouches. It was a slow and methodical task. Every movement stirred the mud, clouding the water and possibly spooking the creatures. Too much noise, and the leeches would retreat. Too fast a motion, and they'd drop off before capture. A leech collector had to master patience, stillness, and a tolerance for discomfort. And there was plenty of discomfort to tolerate. Each bite left a tiny, bleeding wound, sometimes dozens in a day. The risk of infection hovered constantly in the background. Some collectors rubbed their legs with herbs or ash to dissuade parasites or speed healing. Others simply grew used to the sight of their own blood swirling in the water below. Of course, nature had her surprises. Beyond the expected leeches, marshes also hosted snakes, biting insects, and the occasional territorial goose. Falling in, or worse, fainting from blood loss, was an occupational hazard. Still, the demand for leeches was high. Apothecaries stocked them in jars. Wealthy households kept a few on hand just in case of an ailment. Healers needed fresh specimens constantly, and so the leech collectors returned to the water day after day, braving cold mornings and clammy afternoons, all for a living that quite literally took a little out of them every time. The next time you grumble about your morning commute or soggy shoes, imagine standing in a chilly pond covered in bite marks, counting leeches in your jar. Sleepy history indeed. As twilight fell over a medieval village and the church bells rang their slow, solemn notes, one particular figure might be seen moving quietly among the thatched cottages. The sin-eater. Not quite priest, not quite outcast. This strange tradesman occupied a role both shunned and essential, absorbing the sins of the dead through ritual and dinner. In an era when salvation was paramount and the fate of the soul weighed heavily on the living, the end of life came with deep concerns. What if a loved one passed without proper confession? What of sins left unspoken or deeds unrepented? Not every deathbed was accompanied by a priest. Not every final moment allowed for absolution. Here, in the murky overlap between folk belief and religious fear, the sin-eater performed a curious service. For a fee, sometimes coin, more often simple bread, ale, and perhaps a few morsels of meat, the sin-eater would arrive at the home of the deceased. The body, laid out on a table or bed, would be prepared with care. Over the chest of the departed, the family would place a piece of bread or a trencher, a thick slab used as both plate and vessel. The sin-eater, solemn and silent, would sit beside the corpse and begin the ritual meal. With each bite, it was believed, the sins of the deceased passed into the sin-eater. The meal symbolized a spiritual cleansing, a last chance for the soul to be lightened, eased of burden before its journey to the hereafter. Whether this truly worked was anyone's guess, but families often felt comforted by the act. Better, they thought, to try than to risk a restless spirit. Yet the role came at a price, beyond the meagre payment. The sin-eater was both necessary and reviled. People feared them as carriers of darkness, as those who consorted too closely with death. They walked the margins of society, often poor, often lonely. Few would break bread with a sin-eater unless, of course, that bread served a purpose. And over time, the burden grew. Imagine a lifetime of such meals, each bite said to carry the guilt, shame, and regret of countless souls. Whether one believed in the spiritual weight or not, the emotional toll would be hard to deny. The sin-eater became a kind of living reliquary for other people's secrets, a bearer of unspoken histories. There are records of sin-eaters lingering well into the 18th century in parts of Wales and the English borderlands. Their rituals varied, some simple, some elaborate, but all spoke to the same human desire, to unburden the soul, to ensure rest beyond the grave. And for the sin-eater, one more crust of bread, one more shadow added to their own. There are jobs, and then there are jobs, and few in medieval or Tudor England were quite so memorable as that of the gong farmer. In a world without modern plumbing, where privies and garderobes emptied not into tidy sewer systems, but into deep, brick-lined cesspits beneath buildings, someone had to handle the inevitable build-up. Enter the gong farmer, a professional tasked with cleaning out these pits when they became too full to ignore, a process that typically occurred once every few years, though sometimes much sooner in bustling towns or overcrowded inns. Why the name gong? In Middle English, gong was a term for going, specifically human waste. The gong farmer, therefore, was one who dealt with what had been gone. It was a profession both necessary and shunned, surrounded by powerful social stigma and an unmistakable aroma. Work typically began after dark, not only to avoid offending the sensibilities of townsfolk, but because fewer people about meant fewer complaints and a slightly cooler working environment, which was helpful given the conditions. Armed with wooden shovels, buckets, and long-handled scrapers, gong farmers would descend into cesspits through narrow stone shafts or access hatches. There, knee-deep, or worse, they would scoop and haul away the dense layers of waste, sometimes accompanied by an apprentice or helper. The night soil, as it was euphemistically called, was then carted outside the city walls and sold as fertilizer for fields, a profitable if pungent side industry. Despite the dangers and indignities, suffocating fumes, the risk of drowning in soft, unstable sludge, the occasional collapse of aging cesspit walls, gong farmers were paid surprisingly well. The work was so noxious that few dared do it, and those who did earned good wages for their bravery or desperation. Some, in fact, amassed enough wealth to retire early, noses forever dulled, reputations forever colourful. Of course, they were not welcomed at the local tavern or market. The odour clung relentlessly to skin and clothing, no matter how much scrubbing followed each night's work. Marriages could be difficult to arrange, and social invitations were rare. Yet without these unsung labourers, medieval cities would have drowned in their own waste. As you drift deeper into your pillows, picture a shadowy figure beneath the cobbled streets, lamp flickering, shovel in hand, performing a grim yet vital task so that the world above could remain blissfully unaware. In the bustling medieval wool trade, one of England's most valuable industries, Precision was everything. You might imagine the life of a wool merchant or weaver to be a colourful one, but for the Al-Naj officer, it was uniformly beige. The word Al-Naj comes from an old French root meaning to measure. The Al-Naj officer's sole responsibility, ensuring that every length of woolen cloth produced or sold in the realm met exacting legal standards of width, quality, and consistency. Think of it as medieval quality control, performed entirely by eye, hand, and a very long measuring stick. Wool cloth, often woven in narrow domestic looms, was prone to shrinkage, stretching, or general irregularity. Unscrupulous weavers might even try to sneak in uneven bolts or fabrics of subpar material to fetch a better price. Enter the Al-Naj officer, whose steady presence kept the market honest and, in many cases, extremely slow-moving. Imagine arriving early at a busy cloth fair, hoping to sell your wares by midday, only to find a queue of merchants anxiously lined up in front of an officious-looking figure armed with a wooden yardstick, a wax seal, and a frown of permanent suspicion. The officer would unroll each bolt, slowly, meticulously, checking width and length with practiced movements. If the cloth met legal standards, it received an official seal of Al-Naj and could be sold openly. If not, well, back to the loom you went. Disputes were common. Arguments broke out over half an inch here, a stray warp thread there. The officer remained unmoved, issuing decrees as final as royal writs. Because improperly measured wool could not be legally exported or sold at market, merchants held their breath as each cloth passed under the stern gaze of this gatekeeper. The work was hardly glamorous. Days passed in repetitive tedium, surrounded by piles of cloth and frustrated traders. The Al-Naj officer's notebook was a catalogue of the utterly mundane. 5 bolts rejected for insufficient width, 3 yards underweight, seal affixed to dyed twill. And yet their role shaped commerce across kingdoms, regulating one of England's chief exports. As night fell and the fairgrounds emptied, one could still find the Al-Naj officer by lamplight, finishing up the last few measurements, the scratch of the yardstick, the occasional grumble, and the steady sealing of compliant cloth into market-ready goods. A job of patience, precision, and endless repetition. But without it, the wool trade might well have unravelled. Before smartphones, before newspapers, and even before the village gossip could do its rounds over a flagon of ale, there was the town crier, a living, breathing notification bell, clad in wool and brass, clutching a bell in one chilled hand and a scroll in the other. The job? To stand at key corners of the town, outside the market, near the church, or by the well, and shout the latest decrees, proclamations, and, often the true highlight, juicy tidbits of scandal that came dressed as public concern. It sounds simple enough. But in practice, being a town crier was far from glamorous. First, there was the weather. Rain or shine, snow or sleet, your duties remained the same. Long before dawn, while most townsfolk still slept beneath wool blankets and lumpy mattresses, the crier would rise, don rough garments, and make the rounds. Spring might bring merciful breezes, but also the mud of thawed streets and mischievous children trailing behind. Summer, less pleasant than you'd think, sweat pooling beneath a thick tunic, voice cracking under the sun's relentless gaze. Autumn brought damp fog that swallowed sound and chilled bones. And winter, winter. A crier's breath turned to mist mid-sentence, boots slipped on icy stones, and metal bells grew cruelly cold in the hand. Yet duty called, and loudly. Then there were the announcements themselves. Not all news was welcome. A rise in taxes, a new levy on grain, public punishments scheduled for the week, all delivered in clear tones that sometimes met with grumbles, thrown vegetables, or, if one was particularly unlucky, rotten eggs. And the people, oh, the people. Town criers were known and visible, but not always loved. They stood at the awkward crossroads of authority and common life, too public to avoid, too entwined with officials to trust entirely. Some villagers might tip their hats, others might turn away muttering. A few, after a cup too many, might heckle. Moreover, the role demanded clarity of voice and a prodigious memory. Literacy wasn't a given. Many criers learned their announcements by ear and repetition, and heaven help the poor soul who misspoke a name or misquoted a law. Small errors could lead to big consequences when word of mouth shaped the public record. The pay, modest at best, a small stipend, often supplemented by tips for announcing weddings, births, or, more cheerfully, the arrival of travelling merchants with exotic wares. On better days, a mug of ale might be offered in gratitude or pity. And when the rounds were done, a return home meant not rest, but preparation, new proclamations to memorize, messages to draft, tomorrow's routes to plan. Yet in a world without headlines or headlines apps, the town crier was indispensable. A bridge between rulers and ruled, between law and marketplace, between the hush of council chambers and the clamour of the street. So next time your phone buzzes with news, imagine instead a stout figure in a battered cloak ringing a brass bell and shouting into the morning mist, "Oh yes, hear this and be informed." In an era when every home relied on the humble fireplace for warmth, cooking and cheer, chimneys were as common as muddy roads and just as prone to trouble. Enter the chimney sweep, a profession that conjures nostalgic imagery of soot-covered faces and cheerful songs, but in truth was anything but cheerful. The sweep's daily life began before dawn, as it so often did for medieval trades. Their tools were simple, brushes of bristle or bundled sticks, scrapers for stubborn grime, and, in many cases, their own wiry frames, required to squeeze through the tight, twisting confines of stone and brick. Chimneys of the time weren't designed with human passage in mind. They were narrow, irregular, sometimes no wider than a man's shoulders, yet soot and creosote built up relentlessly, forming slick, flammable layers that could spark dangerous house fires if left unchecked. The sweep's mission, to clear those chutes, was sweat, grit, and considerable risk. For adults, it was dangerous work. For the smaller apprentices, often young boys, it was perilous. In many regions, sweeps employed climbing boys, as young as 6 or 7, small enough to wiggle into the narrowest flues. These children, armed with brushes and sacks, would inch their way upward, bracing against walls slick with soot, coughing in the darkness, feeling their way toward daylight. The dangers were many: sudden falls, getting stuck, inhalation of toxic dust, and the ominous threat of soot-wart, a cancer linked to years of exposure. Worse still, chimney design varied wildly. Some angled sharply or branched in odd ways, turning the climb into a puzzle with deadly consequences for a wrong turn. The rewards for this grim work were meagre. A few coins, perhaps a crust of bread. The master sweep pocketed most of the pay, while the boys endured long hours, ragged clothing, and short lives. In towns and cities alike, the figure of the sweep was a common sight, soot-streaked, often coughing, moving from home to home with ropes and rods in tow. They were necessary, but seldom welcomed, a reminder of fire risk, poverty, and the unseen filth hidden above the hearth. And yet, in curious contrast, folklore sometimes cast sweeps as lucky. To see one on your wedding day was thought to bring good fortune. A sweep's brushstroke across a child's head might grant protection. These quaint beliefs did little to ease the sweep's life, but perhaps added a glimmer of recognition in an otherwise thankless profession. As towns grew and chimneys multiplied, the demand for sweeps only rose. And though the Industrial Revolution would eventually usher in new methods, longer brushes, mechanical cleaning, the job remained a harsh and grim calling for generations. So next time you watch a cozy fire, let your thoughts drift upward to the shadowy maze above, and to those who once crawled, coughed, and scraped their way through it, all for the safety of others. Of all the professions to have emerged from the medieval quest for health, the leech collector holds a particularly slimy distinction. In a time when medicine was a curious blend of ancient wisdom, hopeful guesswork, and outright superstition, leeches, yes, those wriggling, bloodthirsty little creatures, were in surprisingly high demand. And where there is demand, there must be supply. Hence, the leech collector. Unlike the barber surgeons with their capes and blades, or the apothecaries with their fragrant herbs, the leech collector plied their trade far from the bustle of town squares. Their world was the marsh, the bog, the reedy banks of slow-moving streams, all rich with the slimy bounty sought by physicians. A typical day began with little fanfare, trousers rolled, tunics tied tight, and wading boots pulled on, though many collectors lacking such luxuries simply braved the cold, bare-legged. The tools were minimal: a pail, a slender stick for balance, and most importantly, the collector's own skin. For you see, the most effective way to harvest leeches was not by net nor by sieve, but by offering oneself as bait. Into the chilly waters they would wade, sometimes for hours, standing motionless among the reeds. Slowly, surely, the leeches would arrive, drawn by body heat and the promise of blood. One by one they would latch on to feet, ankles, calves. And once fat and full, they could be gently plucked off and dropped into the waiting pail. A single outing might yield dozens if the marsh was good and the collector was patient. Of course, there were hazards. Beyond the discomfort of cold water and the constant itching of tiny bites, there was the ever-present risk of infection. In an age without antiseptics, a leech bite could fester badly. Some collectors developed sores that never quite healed, or illnesses from the stagnant waters. And of course, there was always the danger of losing one's footing in the muck, vanishing beneath the weeds. But for all this, leeches fetched a fair price. Physicians prized them for balancing the humours, using bloodletting to treat everything from fevers to headaches to melancholy. Apothecaries stocked jars of them, surgeons carried them on house calls, and aristocrats swore by their effectiveness. The demand meant that leech collectors were, in their own odd way, respected specialists. Their skill in knowing the best marshes, the ideal seasons, and the right times of day could mean the difference between a paltry haul and a profitable one. So next time you encounter the phrase, old medical practices, remember the lonely figure standing waist-deep in a foggy bog at dawn, offering their own blood to fill jars that might one day grace the shelves of a medieval clinic. In the grand ledger of medieval occupations, some roles seemed destined for infamy, if not outright dread, chief among them the executioner. Yet, behind every grim professional stood an often overlooked figure, the executioner's assistant. A role less storied in ballads, perhaps, but no less essential when it came to ensuring that a sentence was carried out efficiently. This was a job one did not apply for so much as acquire, often by inheritance or necessity. The sons of executioners were frequently pressed into service, or an indebted soul might be offered the position to clear what they owed the crown. Volunteering was, shall we say, uncommon. The assistant's tasks were varied and meticulous, because when public justice was at hand, there was no room for sloppy work. It began well before the day of execution, with careful preparation of the tools of the trade. Axes had to be sharpened to a terrifying degree, and ropes checked for fray or weakness. Nothing could be left to chance in a world where botched executions were not only an embarrassment, but a potential spark for public unrest. Beyond the tools, there was paperwork, dull but crucial. Names to be verified, warrants to be double-checked, the precise method of execution clarified by writ or verbal decree. The assistant ensured the correct person faced the blade or the noose, lest a terrible error stain the proceedings even further. On the day itself, the assistant served as the executioner's right hand. They might escort the condemned from cell to scaffold, ensuring none made a sudden bid for freedom. They steadied the rope, adjusted the block, or stood ready with a bucket of sawdust. Because yes, even amid the grim work of justice, cleanliness mattered. Crowd control often fell in part to the assistant as well. Keeping order among the gathered onlookers, some jeering, some solemn, was no small feat. And of course, there were the occasional scuffles or the odd relative hurling insults, or worse, toward the platform. The assistant had to remain calm, focused, professional. The toll of the job was considerable. Ostracism was a constant companion. Many assistants found themselves shunned in public life, greeted with suspicion at the market, avoided at festivals, or denied service at the local inn. And then there was the mental weight. Though their hands may not have directly taken life, they were inextricably tied to the machinery of death. For some, this led to a certain grim resignation. For others, to a life of isolation and quiet guilt, a lonely path, made only lonelier by the very work that sustained them. Yet, for all this, the role persisted, for as long as justice required its visible arm, and behind the executioner's solemn figure, there would always be the shadow of an assistant, unseen by history's brighter lights, but no less present. Among medieval vocations, few held the allure and mystique of the falconer. To command a bird of prey, to loose it skyward with a flick of the wrist, to see it wheel and dive with precision, this was not merely a job. It was an art, one draped in prestige, patronage, and many, many feathers. But before one could rise to the station of falconer, they would first pass through the long, feather-dusted road of apprenticeship, a road far less glamorous than tales might suggest. To be a falconer's apprentice was to enter a world ruled not by men, but by birds, temperamental, demanding birds with sharp talons and even sharper moods. And the first lesson an apprentice learned: the falcons were the stars of the show, and one did not cross them lightly. The days began early. Before the sun crested the hills, the apprentice would be up, feeding the birds their carefully prepared meals, morsels of rabbit, quail, or pigeon. The portions were exact, for too full a falcon grew lazy, and too lean a bird grew fractious. Then came cleaning, endlessly cleaning. Perches had to be scrubbed of droppings, feathers collected, jesses and hoods mended. The falconry mews, those grand enclosures of wood and wire, demanded spotless upkeep, lest illness spread among the prized inhabitants. Handling the birds was an honour earned slowly. At first, an apprentice merely observed, learning to read a falcon's body language, the tilt of its head, the fluff of feathers, the subtle shift of talons. In time, they might graduate to carrying a bird on a gloved fist, feeling the surprising weight and delicate balance of the creature, and then, with great care, they would practice the loftiest skill of all, the release and recall. Hours were spent perfecting the art of launching the bird into flight, watching it circle, then whistling or luring it back with a tidbit of food. One wrong move could mean a falcon lost to the skies, a calamity that would not soon be forgiven by one's master. Beyond the daily care, apprentices also learned the more esoteric aspects of the trade, the breeding of birds, the treatment of falcon ailments, and the long history of falconry itself, a practice stretching from Persian courts to Norman keeps. They studied the hierarchy of birds, from the lordly gerfalcon to the humble kestrel, and the complex etiquette of presenting falconry displays to nobles and royalty. It was a role of both prestige and servitude. An apprentice might spend years tending to another's birds before earning the right to fly their own. Yet the reward for those with patience and love for the craft was considerable. A life spent in partnership with some of nature's most elegant hunters, and a place in courts and castles where few commoners might tread. Emerging from the pungent underworld of the gong farmer, we now drift into a different sort of chamber, one filled not with filth, but with strange fumes, mysterious apparatus, and an air of ancient mystery. Welcome to the alchemist's workshop, and more specifically, the often overlooked world of the alchemist's assistant. For all the romantic notions surrounding medieval alchemists, seekers of the philosopher's stone, masters of transmutation, discoverers of elixirs of life, the reality was rather more chaotic, and for the humble assistant, it was chaotic and exhausting. Before any grand experiment could commence, there were supplies to gather. The assistant's morning often began not with scholarly study, but with a long and rather eclectic shopping list. Mercury from the apothecary, sulphur from the mines, rare herbs from the forest, the occasional chicken egg or scrap of lead. One might be sent out in the dawn mist to hunt for dew-laden spider webs or to barter for fragments of meteoric iron. No task was too peculiar. Upon return, the real labour began. Bellows had to be pumped for hours to maintain the precise temperatures required by temperamental furnaces. Alembics and retorts had to be cleaned, a task made all the more challenging by the sticky residues and faintly dangerous substances coating their interiors. And then there was the constant vigilance. Alchemical recipes, if they could be called that, were more art than science. A slight miscalculation, a single extra grain of salt, or a moment's lapse in stirring could trigger unexpected results. Foul-smelling clouds, spectacular flashes, or the occasional loud bang. It was said that assistants with singed eyebrows were often the most experienced. Beyond the physical work, an assistant was also expected to copy vast tomes of alchemical lore by hand, transcribing labyrinthine instructions in Latin, Arabic, or other ancient tongues. The margins of these texts were often littered with cryptic symbols, personal notes, or illustrations of improbable machines. Intellectually, it was a demanding apprenticeship. The assistant had to learn not only the names and properties of countless substances, but also the philosophy underpinning alchemy, the correspondence of elements, the humours of the body, the influence of the stars. Socially, the role carried an odd mix of prestige and suspicion. To serve an alchemist was to walk a fine line between respectability and rumour. Neighbours might eye the assistant warily, whispering of dark arts, forbidden knowledge, or dealings with the supernatural. Yet the learned and the wealthy often sought out alchemists, hoping for cures, charms, or the tantalizing promise of gold from base metals. For the assistant, days blurred into nights, long hours in the dim workshop, eyes strained by candlelight, lungs filled with the mingled scents of herbs and heated metals. Yet amidst the labour and risk was the hope of advancement, of one day becoming a master alchemist, commanding both the mysteries of the elements and the respect of scholars. It's curious to think that behind every grand castle and bustling market, there were countless unseen hands performing the jobs no one wanted, roles that were vital, if often uncelebrated. From the ash-covered gong farmer to the weary sin-eater, from the candle-flickering alchemist's assistant to the leech-soaked collector, each carved out an existence among mud, mystery, and necessity. As you drift now into your own softer world of dreams, perhaps you'll imagine these forgotten figures moving through the fog of time, shuffling with purpose, tending to the odd and often unpleasant tasks of their age. Thank you for keeping them company tonight. If you enjoyed this sleepy journey, feel free to subscribe, leave a gentle like, or share a comment about your favourite curious old profession, or one you'd prefer never to try yourself. And as always, let us know where and when you're listening from. We love seeing this little sleepy community span so many places. Until next time, rest well and good night. Twilight.